Hi, Seema. Welcome to
Hey,
Economists on Zoom Getting Coffee.
hey, Danny, how are you?
Good. Are you having any coffee today?
Oh yeah, no, I have my coffee cup.
Good. I'm having a decaf Nespresso in the afternoon. Um, I'm really excited to have you as my guest today. I've been reading a lot of your work, and I want to talk a little bit about gender discrimination. I think that might be a good, a terrible way to put it, but I think it's the truth. And when I was reading, I think that when people think about the gender discrimination from an economic standpoint of view, a lot of people go straight to wages and the income gap, which is pretty persistent, and it's been there for centuries or more since we have money, I guess. And it's there in every country, in every industry, everywhere. But I think that what I really what you've taught us with your research is that this is not just about income. It's much beyond income, of course, and it starts really, really early on. So I wanted to start by you telling us a little bit about what how you move the needle, how you think you move the needle in understanding how this discrimination towards female since they're babies,
Yeah.
how it really takes place based on your research in developing countries mostly, but feel free to talk about any country you want.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There are some aspects of gender inequality that we see everywhere. We see in India, we see in the US, we see in Norway and Sweden, like a gender pay gap. But a lot of my research has been on kind of aspects of gender equality that are not as bad everywhere, or maybe not even seen at all in some places, but are really pronounced, especially in India, where I've done a lot of my work. And like you said, that starts very early, prenatally, with sex selective abortions of female fetuses, or just early on in life. And so I think kind of one of the conceptual distinctions that I've tried to make in my research is that there's one kind of discrimination, which is just about if you have sons and daughters, spending differently on them, making different investments in their human capital. And, you see that in rich countries historically, like education went to men before women, but women catch up with economic development. So there's that in India and other developing countries. But there's also this strong desire to have sons that's a very big deal in India. And I think in the US, the literature suggests people want diversity. They want both sons and daughters, but they don't have this, or at least on average, people don't really want to have a son. But what's very true in India and other places like China and the Caucasus region is it's super important to have a son in the family. And that, that son might take care of a couple when they're older, they pass along their property and the family name, etc. But that starts to have all sorts of bad effects for girls. So one is that people will have abortions, so they don't have daughters, so they can have a son. So that's one. But some of my earliest work on gender was actually sort of thinking about how that quest to have a son starts to have negative consequences for daughters, kind of an unintended consequence. It wasn't that parents were setting out to harm their daughters or give fewer resources to the daughters, but that was a collateral damage from this quest for a son. So I'm thinking about my paper with Ilyana Kuzhenko, where we were trying to understand why are girls breastfed less than boys in India. So they get breastfed less, and especially if you aren't getting breastfed, you're probably getting some maybe contaminated milk or water. It's a big deal for health. And so the first thing that would come to mind is like, okay, well, parents vaccinate their sons more than they vaccinate their daughters. They take their daughters to get important medical care less than sons. So all of that is true. But with the breastfeeding gap, kind of our hypothesis and what seems to hold in the data is it's not really that. It's that parents are trying to have another son, and when they are trying to have another son, that leads them to breastfeed their daughters less. And that's, partly because they might know that if you breastfeed, you're less likely to conceive again. And so you stop breastfeeding so that you're can conceive again. But it's also just that, like, parents, if they don't have any sons, they're really trying hard to get pregnant. And if they're successful, then you see that kind of one of the first things women do is stop breastfeeding their current child, their like infant, because, it just could be the physical demands, they're tired, etc. And so those are, again, it's not that the parents are thinking, breastfeeding is valuable. I don't care about my daughter as much as with my son, so I'm not going to do it. It's that they really wanted that son.
Right. So, and it's interesting because you're saying that a lot of the things you could have expected that would become better with the India has grown a lot in the past decades. It seems like some of these aspects will remain. So I guess you're hinting, you've said it, I think, in your work, that there's a cultural aspect to it. Is there hope maybe that, these cultural changes also change with the development of the country? I mean, you could think that in some societies, in the rich countries, like centuries ago, also sons were much, there was a preference for sons, for males in among the kids, and that, as you said, like less so today. Do you think that, I mean, you've shown, I think, in your work a paradox there, because as you grow more, maybe some of the things could disappear, but other things make it
exactly
make it different, right?
Yeah, so I think I actually think the strong desire to have sons isn't something that we saw historically in Europe or the US. And then there's kind of a neat way to look at that, which is, far before there was sex-selective abortion, you would see, if people really wanted to have sons, you would see they would keep having kids until they had enough sons. And the signature of that in the data is that the youngest child in a family, the last child you give birth to, will be disproportionately male. It doesn't skew the sex ratio, but when you look at, like in a census and look at all the kids, the last one should be disproportionately male. And you see that in India, before there was sex-selective abortion. But you don't see that historically if you look at the old censuses in the US and Europe. So yes, there are stories of kind of richer families that want to pass down the business, but this is something that it tends to be in societies that are patrilocal, where there's a really strong norm that the kind of girls live somewhere else, but the eldest son, he sort of takes over the family home and cares for the family. So societies with that kind of, whether historically or today, this is where you see this preference for sons. But yes, coming back to the question of like, will this get better? I think, we might think in some ways norms become, there's sort of a general, we hope there's a general movement towards a sense of equality and human rights. And so, maybe kind of things equalize around the world because there's exposure through television and media and things like that. So I think there is this, hope that kind of norms might get better in some sense, but there's also, it also could be the case that they're very sticky. We know lots of, there's this very nice work by Paolo Giuliano, Nathan Nunn, Alberto Alsina, that kind of whether you historically use the plow in agriculture still seems to influence gender norms today, even though agriculture, none of these societies, like say within Europe, are reliant on agriculture. So norms could outlive their usefulness. And I think there's a really sad irony about, or maybe a kind of a weird paradox about the sex ratio, say like wanting to have sons and having abortions of female fetuses, is that, what we usually think of as progress could be making this problem worse. So, the people want to like,
that's
think about
the irony.
Yeah, exactly. Women as progress, like women have more education and they have more say in households. And we think of that as good. And our first instinct would be, oh, okay, that's going to mean there'll be less sex selection. But part of what happens is women have more say in how many kids they want to have, and they want to have fewer kids. And so the family size goes from 4 to 3 to 2. And in this specific form of wanting sons, is it's really important to have one son. And so if you're having 4 kids, there's a 1 in 16 chance you weren't going to get a son. If you're having 2 kids, there's a 1 in 4 chance. So there are kind of two forces going on, with education or progressivity. Women might say, okay, I don't care quite as much about having a son, but at the same time, the likelihood of not having a son in their total fertility of 2 rather than 4 is going up. And so you've got these two offsetting effects. And so something that we could think of as like our normal
that's as opposed to, you were saying before, that if you could have like 10, 15, and the last one, usually if there's a preference, you would stop having kids when you have a son.
Exactly.
That's not an option anymore.
Exactly. It's an option, but people choose a different route.
Right.
Rather than saying, let me keep making my family size bigger. Now a woman can say like, okay, I want to stay in the labor market because I've got this great job or whatever. So let me turn to this alternative. partly because that technology exists now to have an ultrasound, but also because like they want to have fewer kids. So kind of our go-to policies of like the win-wins of like, let's empower women, let's educate women, for this problem of the sex ratio, it could backfire, or it certainly is not the panacea.
What you're saying is not great news in the sense that it's not enough. Economic growth and economic opportunities is not enough. You have to somehow try to, maybe be inclusive, or I don't want to use the word change the cultural norms, but maybe it's the right word, but like influence them in a way in which, respect for gender is there. That's a tough task, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you change cultural norms? Or
yeah, so I think that kind of this early work of mine was sort of kind of hitting up against this fact that economic forces don't seem to be, we sort of feel like with economic progress we see progress on other indicators we care about, like infant mortality falls and education goes up, and this one, it doesn't seem like it's going to be it's going to naturally occur. And even if it did naturally occur, we might still want to speed it up with policy. But once you see it's not getting better naturally, you have to say, okay, how do I solve this problem? And you could take a different approach of like, let's really try to crack down and enforce the ban on sex selection of abortion. So you could say, I don't need to change norms, that's hard, let me find some workarounds. But yeah, I think it's inspired me to turn to projects that were trying to change those norms. And I'm not an expert on how to change those norms, but I thought it's worth trying to pair up with people who are in a position to do that, policymakers or nonprofits, and try to do that. So one of the projects I'm most excited about that I've been working on is this project that I guess we started around 2012, 2013, that's working with high school kids in India and adding to the school curriculum class discussions about gender equality, beyond the sex ratio, just about equal opportunities, where the NGO called Breakthrough, they're a human rights NGO that focuses on gender. And so what they did is sort of develop a series of sessions that were basically like trying to get kids to think about it and talk about it and debate it, and maybe like second guess whether what they had sort of taken for granted in their communities.
So what kind of conversations they were having?
Yeah, they differed a lot. So it sort of started out kind of like milder, where kids would just talk about what their aspirations were, and at least in the co-ed schools, like it can sometimes be an eye opener for, say, boys to realize that girls also have the exact, very similar career ambitions. Maybe besides cricket player, like there's a lot of overlap in what boys and girls wanted to do. And then kind of realize that there's a disconnect between that and the fact that the female labor force participation in India is less than 25%. So, it's realizing it's not that the women didn't want to work. Like when they were young, they want to work, and then something happens. And I think the session that resonates the most for me is this one around household chores, where they break up into groups and talk about who does various chores, and then they come back together and share. And the answer is always that the women and girls do all of the chores at home. And so the facilitator, like that's the breakthrough kind of was able to take over the government school classroom for an hour every now and then and run these classes. The facilitator would say, like, okay, why is it that women and girls do that? And someone would say, oh, women and girls are like, they're better at cooking than men. And the facilitator would say, well, if that's the case, like, why aren't women cooking in restaurants or at weddings? If they're so talented at it, like maybe they would be more fulfilled if they could cook for more people, or we would kind of create more value. So it's both the kind of economic argument of like, isn't it inefficient to misallocate all this talent, and also just kind of a human rights argument that someone should be able to kind of use their talents. And I think kind of, a lot of kids have this like facile view of like, oh, like, I'm sure we can logically defend this. And I think not all of them are going to have this aha moment, but I can see how for some of them, they're like, yeah, I guess maybe there is something unfair or, economically damaging about this restriction on, women shouldn't be working outside the home.
Right. How do you measure success there?
So what we do in the study is basically measure attitudes and some self-reported behavior. So we've tracked the kids for a couple of rounds of data. So kind of immediately after the program and then 2 years later. And so immediately after the program, we kind of focus on what their views are. Are they, at the beginning, something like 2/3 of people say women's most important role is to be a homemaker, or boys should get more resources for school than girls. And so you want to see, like, do people change those attitudes? And a big risk in this kind of study is people are just telling us what they think we want to know. And so we do some things to try to address this fact of, are these just socially desirable answers? But our goal in the longer run is to see whether this starts to change kind of the harder outcomes that you might expect, like, do the girls who are in the program go to college more? When the boys get married, are their wives working at a higher rate? Those kind of hard outcomes. So, we've had some success, I guess. The other kind of success besides, sort of success within an academic paper is, this initial evidence has caught the attention of policymakers, and so that's exciting. And so I think, part of kind of the ultimate success is, can we take this evidence and like do something in a pilot, and actually, can it successfully be scaled and change a generation's views?
And the challenge is you're going to have to follow these kids for a long time, which from a research standpoint of view must be hard.
Yeah, we've I think it was super valuable to follow them 2 years after the program ended, because like right after the program ends, you think, okay, they're all high on this message, but then it's going to fade. And so what's cool about our results, or I guess exciting from a policy point of view, is that 2 years later, when they hadn't been involved in the program, kind of they still had this attitude change. But you're right, to kind of really see these hard outcomes, we'd have to keep tracking them. So that is hard. But one thing that's nice is most of the outcomes we care about, we can just go back to their parents. And like, we're not going to ask them, did your daughter-in-law or daughter have a sex-selective abortion? We'll just say, like, tell me about your grandkids. Do you have grandkids? And if they list the grandkids, we'll be able to back out things like the sex ratio of that participant's kids. Or we'll ask, is your daughter married? Is she working? Kind of, so that's helpful for, it turns out like tracking people is a whole like new, once you do RCTs and you realize, wow, there's so many logistics to figure out. And then tracking people is a whole nother logistical challenge, especially since people change their phone numbers a lot, and, young people move around a lot. But luckily I'm hopeful, I think it's factually true that most of the parents will stay put over the next 10 years. And so I think our strategy will be, we won't be able to necessarily like keep asking the kids, or, now they're young adults, but asking them their attitudes, but we'll be able to ask their parents some of our key outcomes like employment, age of marriage, age of first child, sex ratio of the kids, and, super important outcomes like that.
Right. And I guess people don't change nowadays their Facebook too often, or their Instagram. So maybe that's an avenue.
No, exactly. I've been thinking about this. It's unfortunate that, like, part of me wants, deregulation, more competition, or not deregulation, regulation and more competition in the social media. But I was, I kind of long for the days where everybody was addicted to Facebook, et cetera. So I think WhatsApp is the like closest there is to a universal, app-based platform. But yeah, I think if somebody gains market share or eyeballs, there's like a bunch of happy development economists who can track their sample more easily.
So Seema, you've changing tracks a little bit. You write a lot in the New York Times. I've been reading most of your columns, and I think what comes across, and I think you mentioned it to me maybe as perhaps one of your goals or one of the things you want to show, is that there's also a lot of lessons from these developing countries to the rich nations. You've talked about the idea of having a public option in health in the US, for instance, and we can learn from developing countries that have done things like that, or government being involved in offering in pushing competition in other aspects too. So that's fascinating. I think that it's really not conventional wisdom to think about that. And I don't know, can you tell us a little bit the one thing that you believe is the one or two things that are most exciting to you?
Yeah, it's a super great privilege to write columns for the New York Times, and my own research is on developing countries, but I have broad interests, and so I try to write about I guess things where there's some evidence that I feel like people don't know and it's really relevant, or, where there's also a way to teach them a little economics. And, some of the columns can be about developing countries, but the New York Times main audience are people who are mostly interested in the US. And so, kind of the way to bring in some development is also just to draw lessons from developing countries for rich countries. And yeah, I think every development economist has a little bit of a chip on her shoulder that, if you write a development paper and you don't cite the related US literature, someone will point this out. But it's not as if, the reverse is true. And I think there's something parallel about kind of how policy lessons flow, that, like kind of let's take lessons from the US and apply them in a poor country. But, the same is also true in all cases. Like, context matters. And so there's always some caution in extrapolating, but I don't think there's sort of like an iron law that the US can't learn from lessons. And so my first column kind of did this, and I started out doing it implicitly and then decided to kind of have an explicit statement of it in the column, which is, we can learn lessons. And so it was about adding a public option to health insurance in the US, or, it was before this past election where we didn't know.
A non-controversial topic at all.
Exactly. But, it was at a time where sort of the public option was viewed as this like kind of ugly stepchild of a single payer system. The debate has changed since then a little bit, but, so I think the point I wanted to make there is that a big impact that a public option can have is on changing market competition and changing prices. So the general equilibrium effects, and especially general equilibrium effects in a context with market power. So, in the Obamacare, the ACA exchanges, if there isn't a lot of competition, you can have higher prices. Having a public option can kind of put some pressure on those incumbent firms to lower prices. So yes, some people will take up the public option, Medicare for all, Medicare or Medicaid option. But others, even if they didn't take it up, they'll enjoy lower prices. And so, this was a point about market competition and then what a public option can do and, how that will change prices. And the most relevant evidence I know of that is from developing countries. One is my own research in Mexico with Giacomo De Giorgi and Jesse Cunha looks at a program where the government, in one of the arms in this RCT, they shipped in food to villages in Mexico. And the poor people who got this food, like, their direct benefit was getting this food. Just like for some people, the direct benefit would be getting this government healthcare plan. But there was also another benefit, both for them and people who weren't recipients of the money, which is prices fell. And especially they fell in kind of remote villages where it didn't look like there was a lot of competition. So kind of this monopolist, or this concentrated market, there was some pressure from this new food source, so they lowered prices, and that can be a big deal. So the other relevant evidence is from India. It's other people's research on the employment guarantee scheme, where that can be thought of as like offering a public option for work, and it has this direct benefit of making transfers to people. That's what's emphasized. But there's another one, which is private sector wages went up, and especially where there looked like there was some monopsony power of employers. And kind of Paul Niehaus, Sandeep Sudhankar, and Karthik Muralidharan, they find that those indirect benefits, that the prices or wages going up, that is actually larger than the direct effect in terms of helping the poor. And so,
I mean, the idea that lack of competition affects all of us, I think that we understand, but nobody can think that to solve it, you need more private sector. Sorry, you need government.
Yeah.
People will think, well, we need more private sector, but there's a reason that private sector is not there to begin with. So that makes a lot of sense. Have you what was the reception you got from that idea?
Yeah, no, to be honest, it's long enough ago that I don't remember. Every time I write a New York Times column, I get kind of a mix of like, fun, cute emails. And then, it's also kind of like a window into what's the zeitgeist right now of, I sort of like it. Well, I very early on saw that kind of whatever I write about, someone's going to send me an email with a Bitcoin angle to it, or like okay, like, can I write a column? It's a little challenge. Like, what's going to be? Can I guess what the blockchain angle to this column is? Because somebody's going to email me with their blockchain suggestion of like how to integrate that with my idea or point.
Well, I'm gonna be reading that because I don't have any idea how blockchain anything.
No, yeah.
Well, Seema, with that, with all those insights, I want to thank you for being our guest today. Your work is really fascinating. I really hope that your projects on trying to fix, your policy implications of everything you're doing will really take off. I think that I'm excited to know that there's a lot of optimism. I think that we can think about it for the future.
Thanks a lot. This has been great. I've been a listener watcher of some of these interviews, so I'm delighted to have gotten to participate.
Thank you, Seema.